my name is Ify Chiejina, Ify for short, and I went to Brighton, England, which was phenomenal. Definitely different from other fellowships that I've done in that there wasn't the expectation to produce any work, as well as seeing any art. And just being in immense and different activities that could either foster my practice or just might just be something that I do one time or just keep as a hobby. So it was definitely different and new to adjust to at first. But once I got into it and I was like, all right, I'm committed to this, it just fell through. And I just found, I think since the beginning, I found it as like, it's just allowing me to recall different memories and parts of myself that I've completely forgotten because I've just been so consumed with being an artist. It was one of those experiences that was like, at first it was like, oh, but I should be producing because that's what I'm expected to do. But then I remember that I was always just asking and wanting to have a break. So it was like a nice space for that, to just not produce. And I think I realized I've come to learn through this fellowship that I'm always an artist even when I'm not working and producing. And I'm still seeing the world as a creative person and understanding it through that lens. So I didn't feel like I was so much divorced as an artist in doing the fellowship. If anything, it was at first it was a little bit hard because my hands are so used to like creating. But it was also really needed for me to take a step back and give myself a break and encountering people while like stepping back a little bit from introducing myself as an artist, because that was actually really, really needed and helpful. At first I was introducing myself like, oh, I'm Ify, and then leaving it at that. I'm doing an artist fellowship, that's it. Or just introducing myself as just Ify and that I'm from the States. But then the questions would be asked of like, oh, what do you do for money, or what do you do for work? And then that's when I was like, okay, I'm a practicing artist, I'm also a teaching artist. But there were some instances where in my head, I never actually executed it, but in my head I'm like, I could literally make up anything. Especially in situations where they weren't expecting me and didn't know I was coming. So I was like, I could just do that. And I was like, no, then I have to keep up that lie. So I was just like, I'll just say, what comes to mind. But I did think of it of like holding back a little bit. And like, even for that first full day that I had, I think if I remember correctly, I did the improv class in the evening. And I didn't state that I was an artist. If anything, I just stated that I was from the States. And that I'm visiting, and then with a one-on-one conversation, that's when I said I was an artist. But it felt good to not share that and kind of just come across as someone who was interested in taking the improv class, and not building on like, oh, well, maybe she's going to use it for a work that she's going to go into or delve into being a performance artist. It was none of that. It was just like, I'm from the States, and talking to one person, I just said I was an artist. And that felt really good. But it felt good to like kind of come in as someone who like, it almost kind of reminded me of like either showing up for an exhibition that I was doing or going to see someone else's show, and then having people pass by saying, seeing it and like, oh, what kind of activity is going on? Or maybe I can just get like a glass of wine and just come in and just enter the space, and just, whether they state who they are or what they do, because it's open to the public, anyone can come in. So I kind of saw it as that kind of opportunity of like, okay, like I heard about it, or I could just come in and walk in as if I heard about it. But then I later stated to them that I was coming from the States and I was doing an artist fellowship, and it kind of felt really good to not have those tools to participate, because I think that would have made it easier to enter the space. It did make it more difficult to enter the space without those tools, but it also made it really rewarding too to sit with them and engage in the conversation that came up, whether it was pertaining to crocheting and knitting, or the debate between arts and crafts and why is there a distinction between them, or even just talking about politics, and understanding the differences in how news media is put out in the U.S. versus other countries, which was a very, very like rewarding conversation to have, because it taught me so much that I wasn't very conscious of. So repeat that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I went to the Hangleton Library, and it was an option to do knitting and crocheting with elderly women who were British, and talking about different experiences, as well as conversations pertaining to the differences between arts and crafts, introducing myself a little bit as an artist, but also being removed from it and just asking them like questions about their own craft and their practice. And, you know, like, what were they knitting or crocheting? What were some of the things they did before? One of them even wanted to know that I was coming, because they were like, oh, we could have done a show and tell. But then in my mind, I'm like, then it would have felt too, like, rehearsed or too planned out. And I kind of liked that it was, like, this exchange of, like, I'm, like, completely different from them in many ways, where I'm not British and I'm not white and I'm not elderly, but I have this interest, and you didn't know that I knew how to crochet. So it was nice to have a commonality there and start from that and be able to know what kind of questions to ask, and like to know what they were referring to when they meant stitches, or like the differences between crocheting and knitting. And it took me back to a point where it's like, I learned how to knit first. I don't remember it at all, but I learned how to knit first. And I wanted to knit because I had seen something in the news about like knitting was like trendy back then, or was starting to reemerge as like something trendy to do. So I was like, oh, I want to do this. And I took one of these games with like these sticks, and my mom had like embroidery thread, not yarn, but I was using that to practice and learn how to crochet through like instructions on the encyclopedia. And then I built from there, because she saw my interest. She was like, okay, I'll get you yarn, I'll get you the actual needles, and then I built from that. But then I learned how to crochet later, and it just took off. It was more, it felt more not familiar, but it just felt more for me than knitting was. And so I just took over and did crocheting, which is something that I do primarily during like the fall, preparing for winter. But there was a part of me that was like, oh, you know, I have been interested in fiber arts, whether or not I actually explore it or not. But it is something that I would like to learn more of, so that I can just see how other artists are interpreting these materials and utilizing it in their work, as opposed to just feeling like, oh, like, I need to do this, or I should do it. Like, it may come up, it may not, but it's something that I would like to see more. With encouragement, I feel more comfortable doing things that feel a bit scary at first, which is the same thing I felt when I went to Brighton, Boulder, or Bolden, Brighton. I can't remember which comes first in the name. But when I went there to do rock climbing, and knowing that there weren't any ropes, but also feeling like, okay, like as soon as I entered, I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna come in, I'm gonna come into the activity, I'm gonna dress up, but I'm not gonna participate because I'm afraid of heights. But then the woman who was like introducing me to the space, she was like, okay, let's see you go across the wall. So I went across the wall, and I was like, oh, it's not that bad. And then she was like, oh yeah, I can go over this. I was like, oh my god. But I saw kids doing this. I'm like, if kids are doing it, I have to try. And then so she was like, oh, you can touch this and go up and touch until you touch like the red, because you have to touch the red with both hands, and then that's when you know you come back down. So I was just like, dear God, I'm not doing this. But she was very encouraging, so I was like, all right, I'll try. I was like one slot down from the top, and then she was like, okay, maybe you can try again. There's also ones where you can go across the wall. So I kept going across the wall, and then after a point, I'm like, maybe I should try again. I might not touch it, I may, but we're gonna try again. So I did that, and I did it. I was able to do it, I think, twice or three times before calling it a day, and before the day was over. So that felt really good to do that, and know that it activated a few memories of pertaining to being afraid of heights, but also remembering that when I'm encouraged. I feel like I'm capable of doing it. And then it also kind of took me to a place of being a teaching artist, where it's just like, all right, when I do demonstrations, let me be more mindful of like, all right, being more encouraging and being supportive, and actually doing a more in-depth demo, taking into consideration that everyone learns differently and at their own pace. So it kind of took me to that point, which I was like, all right, this is really good that this artist fellowship is activating these different memories, and also making me think of ways that I wasn't so much aware of. Like I was like, okay, I'm an artist, so I do this, or I'm a teaching artist, so I do that. But it took me to a place where I was constantly the student, or constantly remembering things I did when I was very young, and being in some instances where I was introduced, like, okay, we're getting someone who's from America, and they're doing they're like, what are you doing again? Like, how is this program set up? And then explaining that to them, and being someone who was the person that people were interested in knowing more about. That was really nice and really interesting. And then, like, I think for many instances, or wanting as an artist to be that person who's like, oh, when I have a show, I want, as many people to come through or to come by, and like knowing that at those instances the attention is on me, or that I have to answer these questions about my art and what I do, about my practice. But it was nice to have that level of attention as a person,